and has worked with world-leading brands and agencies, as well as working with Facebook and Google. Here to talk to you about our new product Canvas, please welcome Paul Adams.
Hey everybody, so I'm Paul, and the talk we're going to go through is pretty different, I think, to most of the talks today. Up until now, from what I heard and seen, there was lots of very practical, pragmatic tips, things you can walk into tomorrow into your work and action pretty much straight away. This is going to be very different, and I imagine Peter's will be too. It's some journey into a version of the future, and the reason that I want to talk about this is lots of other things I could talk about in terms of building products and designing things, but I think it's really important. I think that as a profession, user experience or product design or however you want to call it has grown in importance inside companies, and more senior leadership recognize its value. And sadly, I think a lot of people are missing the bigger opportunities. Most because they're not thinking big enough. And large parts of this are certainly influenced just by my own personal experience. I worked at Google, and I worked at Facebook, and I worked on products like Gmail and YouTube. And so these are obviously the kind of dominant companies of our time in our world. But before that, I worked in consultancy in London for an agency called Flow Interactive, and worked with a lot of companies and clients, like I'm sure most of you guys work with. And I think these lessons are actually applicable to that world as well. Most recently, I've left those big companies and joined Intercom. We're a startup, a small startup, growing fast, which is obviously a good thing. So it's basically two parts to this. The first part is that I don't think people think about the internet in the most useful way. So I'm going to try and reframe possibly how some of you guys think about the internet. And the second part is a little bit more practical and actionable. It's related to the screen of apps that we see. Again, I hear lots of conversations where people are obsessed about getting their app on that screen. And I think I just still think that's the best way to think about this. And I think that this screen is going to become much less important in the foreseeable future, and other things are going to take their place. And so I'll go through those pretty fast. OK, so the first part of this. So when I think about the internet, I don't think about pages or even apps. I think about networks, and I think about systems. The internet, of course, itself is a network. I think it's just much more powerful to frame it that way. And one of the best ways of understanding how the internet might impact our lives is by looking backwards and seeing how other networks influenced our lives. And there's lots and lots of examples of this, and I only have a couple today. The first one is the road network. When the combustion engine was invented, things like this started going around the streets. And at the time, this was pretty crazy, because before this, you had horses and steam engines, and this thing was something different. And people got caught up in the combustion engine itself, the technology itself, even the car itself. And still today, many people have huge passion for cars. But the car in and of itself was not actually all that interesting compared to other things that happened as a result of this. The first thing is that cars led to this expansive road network. The US government spent a lot of money and time building out this huge network of roads all over the country so that they could distribute people and goods, and even reallocate the population from the east to the west, and all sorts of things like that. And it really changed society. And the people who built these things and designed these things didn't really see it coming. They couldn't have predicted it. And I feel that we as designers, or researchers, all these terms are pretty interchangeable at the best of times, but we in this industry, I feel, are in a similar position where we look at things like iPhones or Android phones or the latest version of phones or hardware and software, and are pretty obsessed by the technology. And this is a very similar photograph to many of us standing over a whiteboard or over someone's screen and peering in a new prototype or a new sketch or whatever. But I think we need to think much bigger than that. And if you kind of follow this analogy, the car led to suburbia. So it really changed society. It changed where people live. It changed how they interact with their friends, their neighbors, their families. And it really changed commerce. It led to big box retail. So before the car and before this road infrastructure, it wasn't feasible to build businesses on the edges of towns where land was cheap, but the car and the network changed that, and trucks changed that. And so that fundamentally altered economics, and it fundamentally altered how these larger companies could exist and bring in goods, buy them a huge volume for much cheaper, truck them in, which meant that local businesses found it very hard to compete. So it radically altered society socially, and it radically altered commerce and economics. There's lots of other examples of these networks that have huge scale. Electricity is another one. And I think, again, electricity is an incredible thing that we take for granted. None of us really came in today and we're like, oh, the lights are on. Glad that's cool. It's just, we don't think about it. And yeah, it really changes life, and it's relatively new. It's only 100, 200 years old. And it's pretty incredible. Like, this is a photograph from NASA. If you're in space, which obviously none of us have been, I assume, you can effectively look down at Earth and see where people are. You can literally see where people live. So here's the Iberian Peninsula. You can see Madrid and Barcelona. You can see the northern tip of Africa. You can even start to see that, like, Africa has less electricity than Iberia does. And it's fascinating. But electricity also changed society. It led to things like this. We take this for granted. I thought it would be a good photograph for the north of England. I'm not sure whose grand this is, but we take this for granted. We go to football matches, and the lights are on, and the thing is happening in the dark. But this didn't happen 100 years ago, or even less than that. It's changed how we live, and it's changed the types of things that we do. And it's changed how we gather. It's changed where people eat. It's changed who they eat with and when they eat, and all sorts of things like that. And the reason this is important is because the internet is also a network, just like roads, just like electricity. And I feel like it's incredibly young. It's only about 20 years old for all practical purposes, which is, for a media technology or a communication technology, is a very short space of time. Most of the dramatic media technologies or communication technologies of the last few hundred years have actually matured and stabilized over the course of many decades, and in times hundreds of years. So it's very, very young, and yet, we, as a discipline, as an industry, often take the things that are happening today, as the status quo, as the way that things should be, and don't think about the internet as this expansive network. Don't think about systems. Don't design systems. And I'll talk about that a lot later on. So even though the internet's only 20 years old, it's already altered and radically changed, in some places, very, very common experiences we have. So news is a fantastic example. Most people now get, or many people at least, get breaking news from places like Twitter. That's very different. Even a decade ago, most of our parents, for example, probably sit down and watch the news at 10, or in Ireland, it's the news at 6. And that's when they get breaking news and latest news. Or they buy a newspaper, which is something that has news that's 24 hours old. And so this has just radically changed, and it's radically changed in a very short space of time. The internet's also changed how governments get elected. Obviously there was the Arab Spring, and there was a lot of things that happened across the Middle East. People talk about ISIS, and that they are actually incredibly good at using the internet to fuel that movement. And it's true in the US as well. A lot of people say that large parts of President Obama's election was down to how they use social media. And so the internet has radically changed how people elect their governments, and even opens out questions about whether governance should be a thing at all. Right? These are like really, really, really big fundamental things. And it's changed games. It's changed how we play games. It's led to things like Minecraft, which is a pretty incredible thing. But even here, games, of course, are almost as old as villages are and tribes are. Human beings have played games forever. But the internet is changing how we play games. I'll never forget, we had God, I don't know, this ages me a little bit, but we had some Nintendo that I can't remember, but we had Super Mario Mario Kart, and suddenly there was this incredible experience where I could race people in Japan. Right? Like, I was sitting halfway across the world, I'm Luigi, and there's someone there, Mario, and they're in Japan, and that's like an incredibly new thing that was never possible before. And I mentioned that the road network changed commerce. Of course, the internet changed commerce, Amazon being the prime example. But what's most interesting to me is not that we have all these e-commerce sites, which I think will rapidly change, by the way. This is much more interesting. It's actually changed how real-life business has worked and real-life commerce has worked, because now suddenly all these people who have things like rent, expensive rent, and lots of staff working in shops have to alter their fundamentals of their business to compete with things like Amazon. And so it's like this network is actually influencing things in all sorts of directions. This is my gratuitous family shot, by the way. I have 2-year-old twins, and well, I won't even go there. I have 2-year-old twins, and they were born in San Francisco, where I lived. I moved back to Ireland about a year, or just under 2 years ago. And of course, my parents were in Ireland, and my parents-in-law were in Ireland, and all my family and friends were in Ireland. And it was incredible because they effectively experienced this moment in our lives very differently from even people 3-5 years ago. We were able to share those experiences and talk about it, and they could see photos, and they could see photos of the children almost in real time. Thankfully, the birth itself was not broadcast in real time. Maybe that day is coming too, I don't know. But it's a very different thing, and I'm sure all of us here have friends and family all over the world, and we can keep in touch with them and understand what they're doing and know what they're doing and communicate with them in ways that weren't even possible a very short number of years ago. And so the internet is making this possible. It's changing how we navigate our world. There was a time, again, very, very recently, where you would bring a map around, and you'd get out of a train station or airport, and you'd have a map, and you'd kind of be trying to turn this thing. And now, most people don't even think about it. They come out of the train station, and they're almost figuring out where they go, moment by moment. And you have things like Street View directions, which, you don't even have to look at the world, which is kind of probably a bad thing. But people can literally just follow their phone and not even think about where they're going, what neighborhood they're in, how long it's going to take, et cetera, et cetera. It's just changing how we navigate our world. And so, these changes are really, really big. And I personally feel that most of us, and I include myself in that, this is something that I've only come to realize, I think, and maybe I'm wrong about this, I don't really know, but come to think over the last few years that we're actually missing the opportunity, and that's obviously a problem. That we're not acting like we have this incredible transformational technology in front of us, this thing that has never been seen before. It's incomprehensible to understand in terms of its scale, and it can enable incredibly new things. And it can really change how businesses work, and it can really change how people interact with businesses and how people interact with each other. And again, the best examples I have to really understand this is to look backwards rather than forwards. And one big thing that I learned at Facebook was a lot of people in the design team at Facebook read a lot about other technologies, other media technologies, like what happened when the printing press was invented. They study that and try and take lessons from it. I'm not going to go through all these, but the pattern I'm about to describe actually has happened pretty much universally with all these new media and communication technologies. I'm just going to mention 3 of them. So the printing press, incredible technology, incredibly new invention. And some people say that the Reformation could never have happened without the printing press. And of course, the Reformation just altered the landscape of Europe pretty fundamentally and irreversibly. But when people were thinking about the printing press and trying to understand what it was for when it was first invented, they started printing huge manuscripts. Because what they saw was that what is this thing for? And they looked and they saw monks making these big tomes. And they're like, oh, those monks, we can help them by reprinting and reprinting these big tomes. And didn't really understand that they could make newspapers, or even for the Reformation, pamphlets. The printing press was about 100 years old or so, before people started printing things that ultimately helped the Reformation. There's lots of other examples. The telephone is probably my favorite example. This is a picture of Alexander Graham Bell, who most people credit with inventing the telephone. That's an entirely other story. It's incredibly interesting because he was in the same situation a lot of startups are today. He was pitching his invention and trying to get money for it, get investment, very, very similar. And his pitch was that the telephone is for broadcasting. It was, you'd put a telephone on a stand like this mic, and you'd put it on a stage like this one, and you could broadcast this event, and people could dial in their telephones hundreds of miles away and listen in, and it was for religious events or for music events and so on. And like a large parts of that were attributed to the idea that newspapers had started to take off as a thing, and mass media, this mass public, was a relatively new phenomenon. And so Alexander Graham Bell's thinking with the telephone was largely filtered by this idea of what was happening then, which was this idea of mass communication. And the third example is TV. TV and movies, I guess. The first movies were not the kind of beautiful story arcs that we see today. They were these really strange, if you ever see them now, really strange, effectively like snippets of everyday life, like little movies of everyday life, all stitched together. And there was no narrative at all, really. And it was really modeled on newspapers. It was like these individual stories that didn't really connect together. It's pretty fascinating. I'm going to show you the first TV ad that was aired. It's a little clip, a little video. And this encapsulates this idea.
America runs on Bolivar time.
That's it. What happens next? This is an awesome example because this is a print ad, a poster, and a radio ad smashed together. That's all that is, a print ad and a radio ad. So people see this thing and they realize they can advertise on this new television media and or medium. And they look around and they see the radio and they see newspapers or print, and you're like, oh, just smash them together. And so we're in a very, very similar situation. Marshall McLuhan, who I'm a big fan of, I'm sure many of you are as well, describes this better than I ever could. He says that we're walking backwards into the future. We basically look around us and apply the patterns that we use with existing media and apply those to a new medium. And so the first TV ad, people looked sideways or looked backwards and tried to figure out, what can we take from that world and apply it to this new thing. And this is a huge pattern. And this is the problem that I'm describing. I think that we are guilty, and again, I include myself in this. We are guilty of exactly the same thing. We're guilty of thinking with the internet, this incredible, incredible invention, and applying the ways we work with existing media, and applying the ways existing businesses work and apply it to the internet. And I think that needs to change. And I think the people who embrace this change and start thinking about some of the things I'll talk about in the second half of this, we'll just start to see dramatic business results. I've seen it a whole bunch of times now. I know there's a big BBC studio in Manchester, and I'm really sorry if someone here works at the BBC, because I'm about to kind of crap on this. I think the BBC are incredible, for the record. An incredible organization. But this is just a great, great example of this. This is the BBC News website, obviously. This, to me, just looks like a newspaper. It just looks like print. It's beautifully designed. The grid looks good. The font, all these things, all these visual things. It's great. But it just looks like print. And if you think what's happening in news, and you think about Twitter and breaking news on Twitter, Twitter is a system. Twitter isn't a web page. It's a system. And I just think that organizations like the BBC, especially older, bigger organizations, are making the mistake that McLuhan talks about. And almost everyone is guilty of it. And I think that we can just do better. So that's the first part of this, that we need to stop thinking about pages and screens, which is what dominates people's thoughts, and start thinking about systems and designing systems. Twitter is a great example of a system. It's not a page. It's not a bunch of screens. And the BBC website, to me, just looks like it was designed in Photoshop. It just, if you look at it, you can just see the Photoshop layers in there. Okay, so part 2. This is, again, I'm dating myself a bit here. When I kind of first encountered the internet, this was the experience I had. You'd literally go upstairs to your bedroom, log on to the internet, look at a bunch of pages, and it looked a lot like this. Just a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of pages linked together. Peter can clearly talk about this far more eloquently than I can. But I think this world is disappearing, and it's disappearing pretty fast. It's disappearing for a bunch of reasons. One is that this kind of distinction between online and offline is disappearing. So, thanks to mobile devices, things that are in our pockets, we're basically kind of online all the time to the extent that that's actually going away. And we're always connected. We're always connected to people. We're always connected to our friends, our families. We're always connected to news and content. And effectively, if the right things are in place, pretty much any business anywhere in the world could get in touch with us, send us content, or inversely, we could communicate with them and talk to them. So it's a pretty big change. And a lot of people ask me about mobile and like, how do you think about mobile in this world? And I actually think I hate the term mobile. I think it's a very, very misleading term. I think thinking about things like devices or screen sizes is just a very, very bad path to be on, because all the stuff's merging. The usage of all these devices is merging. It's very, very gray where a phone stops and a tablet ends. You've got like phablets, I don't even know what they are, but the way I think about this is that you have screens everywhere, and they go from very small, like increasingly on your wrist or on your body, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you can almost just look at Android and iOS, and you can see screens of all shapes and sizes all the way up to like big giant cinema displays. So for me, a much more powerful way to think about this is about access. So these devices that we can take with us give us unprecedented access to information, and they give us unprecedented ability to publish content, create new content. And obviously, these two things are related, accessing information and other people being able to publish them in this huge network where everything is connected, people, objects, content, etc. And this system means that businesses have learned a lot about individuals, for better or worse. Lots of things, things like their demography and behavior, or their location, or who their friends are. Also things like their hopes and dreams or aspirations, things like acute needs that they have, like right here, a very specific moment in time. And all this is leading to an entirely different product canvas. And again, I use the word product very intentionally vague, I guess. I don't actually call UX, I call it product design. That's a whole other conversation that we probably shouldn't get into. But this is, to me, this is basically everyone here's canvas. We have this incredible network, and this is like the tip of the iceberg, still very early, and most people aren't thinking about all these things. They're not thinking about who else could you integrate with, what APIs exist, what SDKs exist. How can we take our core business and all the things that are great about that and partner with other things that are freely available, and make something better. Facebook's a great example of this. So, a lot of people at Facebook who work there are fond of saying this, that it's not a blue and white website, and it's not a blue and white app. It's a system. It's an ecosystem. And, most people who think about Facebook think about things like the news feed or timeline, or businesses and brands think about their page. And these are pages, these are screens, this is not network thinking. This is not people thinking about systems and networks. This is, again, back to McLuhan, I think quite blinkered and looking backwards, trying to apply print media and all sorts of other things to Facebook. Even that metaphor of a page is very telling. Facebook is, all these pages on Facebook are actually aggregations of data. That's it, aggregations of data. And different rules and different algorithms decide what goes in each one of those. But underneath all of that is this much more granular thing, this much more atomic unit of content. And that atomic unit could be a person, it could be a photo, all these objects. It could be a video, it could be a news story. And then there's people, I guess people objects, if you want. And all Facebook is doing is connecting all these things together. Connecting people together, connecting content together, trying to figure out what should be seen. So it's a system, and it's a system built up of lots of different rules. And that's the most powerful way to think about it. And there's lots and lots of examples of this. I'm not going to go into too many because I don't have much time, but Nike Plus is another huge example of this. Nike Plus is, this is a poor example because I think they're discontinuing the fuel bands. I'm not even entirely sure. But it's like shoes, and it's like embedded chips in clothes, and it's things you wear on your wrist, and it's apps on phones and websites and all sorts of things. Intercom is another example that I like to use to describe this, because this is like our inbox. Intercom, by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm not going to talk too much about it, is a platform for web and mobile businesses to see what the users are doing, communicate with them, and so on. So it's very much a communication product. And the temptation when you join a company like that, the first thing I wanted to do was redesign loads of this stuff. I was like, oh God, that's crap, I can do better than that. Right? And you want to take this screen, this image, and change it up. And I did, and I screwed it up a whole bunch of different ways. And I screwed it up because I didn't understand the system. I didn't understand all the objects and relationships and components that were underlying this page, the things that actually made this page exist at all. And it's just very, very misguided thinking. And so I took a step back and asked myself, what is it? And then you start to think about other things, like, okay, there's these objects, and then there's these tools, and these tools that composers can manipulate content, like messages or photos and so on. And then there's different views, and these different views just aggregate this data in all sorts of different ways. And I ended up drawing this big diagram, which I won't get into, but what's really important to realize is that this diagram is not an information architecture in the kind of ways that most people would classically understand that. It's a system diagram, right? These aren't pages necessarily. It's a system. Some of these are objects. Some of these things you can't even see, right? They're like happening on the back end of these products. And it's really, really important, I feel, for people to start thinking about this. Facebook Messenger is another great, great example. When you message someone on Facebook using Messenger, you never think about whether they're on or whether they are on a mobile device, right? You never think about, are they online, right? You just message people and it just gets delivered. And then you see like that they saw it. And a ton of stuff is happening at a system design level to do that. And the people who design that system are not engineers, they're product designers, right? They're UX people. And it's really, really important, I think, for us to start thinking increasingly about this. The last thing I'm going to talk about is I wrote this post about 2 weeks ago, and it's called The End of Apps as We Know Them. And a lot of people read it, and it's very, very directional. It's not prescriptive at all. But I think it's interesting to think about this trajectory of where apps are heading, because I don't know, I think it's an interesting conversation. I've learned a lot from publishing this. There was like tons of comments and stuff. So I'd love to hear if you guys have feedback as well about where this is all going to end up. But it's a pretty simple trajectory. So notifications on phones used to just be signposts, right? They didn't do anything. So if you got a notification like this one and slid it or tapped it or whatever, it would just take you to that. It would deeply take you into that part of that app or to that action or screen or whatever. But that's changing, and it's changing really fast. Older versions of Android before Lollipop, which is basically being launched right about now, started to do this too. The previous version of Android had things like reply or retweet or favorite inside the notification itself. So suddenly that changes the notification. There's content in there. It's not just a signpost. There's content and there's actions. And iOS 8 took this a bit further. This is a very interesting incremental development. It took this a bit further. And on iOS 8, the notifications are interactive. So if you get an iMessage from somebody, you can actually pull down on it and reply. So you can create the content inside the notification. You do not need to open the app. You can interact with the app through the notification. And Android Lollipop's taken this another level again, where they've broken up these individual things into cards. And you can see them starting to stack the cards at the bottom. And suddenly you have this experience where they have a notification, like they're notifying you, hey, this thing's interesting, and content inside it, and actions inside it. And suddenly you have this experience where people don't have to open apps at all. And if you keep kind of following this trajectory, this is where we are today, it feels obvious to me that these cards will soon house full product experiences, and apps start to become services rather than these destinations. And this is a photograph from Emmett Connolly, who just joined us at Intercom. He was one of the guys who started the Android Wear project at Google. And this is the real photo from him relocating back to Dublin from San Francisco of his flight. Right? It's a real photo. And it's fascinating because there's no app there. He's not opening an app to experience that. It's just bringing the content to him. And possibly other versions of this, you could just check in for your flight and do a whole bunch of other things. So this screen, I think, is becoming far less important. I don't know, will it disappear entirely? And I'm definitely not saying apps are dying, which is what some people interpreted from that post. I'm just saying that apps are changing. They're really, really changing. And I've done a bunch of writing about cards as well, going back quite some time. And again, this is my personal belief. I don't know if this is actually going to happen, but it's kind of just where I see things going. That cards are just going to become this incredibly pervasive way we interact with software and content and people and all sorts of things. But what's really important is to distinguish between cards as a design pattern and cards as third-party content. And again, this goes back to this idea of systems thinking. People who are designing things and not thinking about systems are like, wow, cards are this awesome design pattern. Like you look at all the apps on your phone, they're all starting to look like cards. But that is like by far the less important thing. What's far more important is that these cards can contain third-party content. It's actually system design. You're not designing these nice screens with these nice borders and things like that. And Twitter is doing fascinating things. You should look into Twitter cards. Really, really fascinating things. Google Now is also an incredibly interesting early example of this. And again, like some people who read that blog post were saying things like, Google Now's crap, you know, I opened it and like it was like a bunch of rubbish. That's like, I don't know, maybe. But you should think about what's happening there at a conceptual level. Like directionally to me, it's really, really interesting, and it points to some version of a future that I think is going to happen. But Google Now basically is bringing information to you. It's trying to understand, based on everything it knows about you, this new product canvas, bringing information to you and starting to show you things that it thinks are relevant. It's really, really interesting, and it starts to ask you these things in blue boxes to start learning. And this is amazing. I gave a talk in Istanbul a few months ago, and in the talk, I opened Google Now at breakfast, or that day of the talk, I opened Google Now at breakfast. And this is what it looked like, you know. Okay, it showed me nearby interactions. That wasn't too good because I was going to go to a conference. But it showed me what Turkish for good morning was. Wasn't cool. You know, I was able to say that to people in the hotel and probably butchered it. And you know, it said things like, it told me how much the Turkish currency in euro current conversion was. Well, that was obviously helpful too, right? And I didn't have to open an app to do it. I didn't open XE currency app to get that information. So when you think about these things, these cards, you've got to realize that these are containers for content. It's a great design pattern for screens of all sorts of shapes and sizes. But it is much more powerful to think about it as a system that can house all sorts of content. And the best way I've found to describe this to people is to stop designing destinations and start thinking about publishing and publishing tools. You know, almost all the stuff we design is destination driven, right? And people talk about this. They talk about like getting people to their app, driving traffic, right? You've got to look into these metaphors people use and these analogies people use. Like, you know, traffic is like a one-way kind of, trying to get everyone down this like one-way funnel or something like that. And that's not thinking about systems and not thinking about all the different ways these things can be connected. And you know, who knows where this will end up in the foreseeable future, but I think the experience that we have with products and services is going to dramatically change. Again, the internet is so young. You know, maybe it will look like this, where you have a stream of content on your phone coming from Facebook, coming from Twitter, very, very similar to Google Now. If you just imagine Google Now opening out to other third parties, you know, maybe you can start moving horizontally through these things. So, you know, as you get down and you see a Facebook card and, you know, there's interesting stuff on there, you start going sideways and that's more Facebook. I don't really know how this is going to end up. Of course, it's going to be on people's wrists. You know, I'm a big believer in wearable technologies. I was very skeptical of it. I'm very bad at predicting these things, by the way, which is a whole other story. Maybe you shouldn't listen to me at all today. I thought the iPad was a big, giant phone. I was a bit wrong about that. But I think Apple have done something very interesting. I think Android Wear is really, really cool as well. I think these are good things. So, you know, this to me is the beginning of the end for apps as destinations. And by the way, when I say apps, like, I had this crazy conversation with someone recently, like, what's the difference between a web page and a web app? And if you want to really melt your brain, you should have that discussion with somebody. Like, it's very unclear what the differences are these days. But so when I say apps, if you think you design websites, this is equally applicable to that. One of the biggest criticisms of this kind of thinking was that you can't create content. You know, they're like, well, okay, so you got all these cards. It's like Google Now. What if I want to take a photograph? What if I want to create content? You know, write a story. All these kinds of things. And like, to me, this stuff is already happening. There's so many signs for this. So, you know, like the phone icon on home screens of phones, I don't know how many people take photographs this way, but I imagine it's a large amount. I imagine lots of people do not open the camera app to take pictures because it's faster to do it this way. And what's interesting is that you're starting to see things like this where, and again, this is like Android's latest version, where you know, you can hit, when a photograph is taken, a little thing comes up that says share in this card, in this notification system, and you hit share and you get this guy, which is looks a bit crazy because of all the options. But the system is really fascinating. You can like share photographs to Pinterest or to Facebook or to Google Drive or all these places without ever opening those apps. And again, this is like just one tiny sign, but if you extrapolate this, I think you just get to really interesting places. So I'm going to leave you guys with one closing thought, and this may be a bit crazy, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's intellectually interesting. And again, like, I would challenge all of you to really think about these things in your line of work. And again, maybe this is not what will happen, but certainly what will not happen is the status quo that we have today. Things are evolving far too fast for that. But if you think about a business like the New York Times, and think about the idea that they publish news stories, obviously, and those news stories get consumed, and you start to think about, well, where do they get consumed? And you say, well, they got consumed on Twitter and on Facebook, and actually the eyeballs, if you like, although I hate that term, it's a bit weird, but the eyeballs are much more on Twitter and Facebook than they are on NewYorkTimes.com. And you're suddenly thinking, oh, most of our staff are actually trying to build that website over there, but actually most of our value is coming from these other places. And that makes you think, why do they have a website? Right? Why does the New York Times have a website? Now, you can argue all sorts of things about advertising models, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I think there's like counter-arguments for those things. But it's intellectually interesting to think, why did the New York Times have a website? If they could pour all of their money and all their time into just creating extremely good content in this system that's optimized for all of these different screens and media types, et cetera, they possibly don't need a website at all. They could possibly be in a very successful business and be a much more influential business by thinking about designing for these systems. So that's it. Maybe that's totally crazy, but I'll leave that with you. These are 3 things to take away from this. One is to start thinking about networks and start thinking about systems. Start designing systems. Stop designing screens. Stop designing pages. I really believe you're selling yourself short if you do that. And start thinking about this underlying architecture and this idea of connectedness. And last but not least, start to think about this emerging paradigm around cards rather than apps. And not cards as a design pattern. That's pretty cool and useful too. Some people believe that responsive design kind of goes away if you have cards, which is a whole other conversation. But don't think about it like that's a good thing. But think about it as these houses of third-party content. If you want these slides, by the way, you can just email me. Email is there, and I'll send you a link to download the slides. If you want them straight away, I can do it later tonight. Just email me, and otherwise that's it. Thanks.